They questioned her skills, ignored her warnings, and dismissed her expertise. Until the unthinkable happened. Now, as disaster unfolds miles above Earth, the fate of an entire crew rests in the hands of the one person they doubted the most. What happens when the line between arrogance and survival blurs? Let us know in the comment section below. The moment Dr. Naomi Carter stepped into the control room, she felt the weight of skepticism in the air. It wasn't her first time in a room full of men who doubted her credentials, but something about being inside the heart of NASA's most ambitious mission made the condescension sting a little more. She had worked her entire life for this moment, spent years developing the AI-assisted propulsion systems that would take Orion 7 deeper into space than any human had ever gone before. And yet, as she joined the final pre-hit briefing, she could feel it. The sideways glances, the small smirks, the unspoken challenge behind every question tossed her way. Commander Jack Ellison barely acknowledged her as she took her seat. "All right, let's get through this quickly," he said, his voice sharp with authority. "Final checks are complete. We launch in less than 24 hours. If there are any concerns, speak now." Naomi hesitated for half a second before clearing her throat. "I ran another diagnostic on the auxiliary thruster systems this morning," she said. "There was a slight variance in the fuel injection sequence. It's within safety parameters, but I'd recommend recalibrating before—" Ellison cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Dr. Carter, we've been running these checks for months. If Mission Control isn't worried, I'm not worried." A few chuckles rippled across the room. Naomi swallowed the frustration rising in her chest. "I just think an additional sweep wouldn't hurt." Dr. Ross Taylor, the chief engineer, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "With all due respect, Naomi, we've got bigger concerns than chasing down decimal points. This mission's been greenlit. Unless you think there's a major failure risk, let's not waste time." There it was, the subtle challenge. She could argue, push harder, but she knew how this played out. She'd spent too many years in academia and aerospace development to not recognize the pattern. If she insisted, she'd be labeled difficult. If she let it go and something went wrong, she'd be blamed for not being more assertive. It was a no-win situation. So she nodded, understood. The meeting moved on, filled with discussions on trajectory calculations, oxygen reserves, and emergency protocols. But Naomi barely heard any of it. Her mind kept circling back to that thruster variance. It wasn't just a decimal point, it was an anomaly. And anomalies had a way of turning into disasters. Hours later, she stood in the hangar, staring up at Orion 7 through the massive glass observation window. The ship was a technological marvel, sleek, towering, a testament to human ingenuity. And yet, all she could see were the invisible threats, the minor miscalculations, the overlooked details that could turn a flawless launch into a death sentence. "You look concerned." She turned to see Dr. Ryan Caldwell, one of the mission specialists, standing beside her. Unlike the others, he didn't look at her with the same dismissive amusement. His tone was genuine. "It's nothing," she said. He gave her a knowing look. "That's a lie." Naomi exhaled, staring at the ship again. "The thruster variance. It's been bugging me all day." Ryan was silent for a moment, then shrugged. "If you're worried, you should say something." "I did. And—" She smirked bitterly. "Allison doesn't think it's worth looking into." Ryan leaned against the railing. "For what it's worth, I'd trust your instincts over half the people in that room." The words caught her off guard. She glanced at him, but his expression remained neutral, as if he hadn't just offered the first real validation she'd received all day. "Thanks," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "We haven't even left the ground." Launch day arrived in a blur of movement. The countdown, the final checks, the nervous energy buzzing through the air like static electricity. Naomi sat strapped into her seat, her helmet secured, hands gripping the armrests as the ground crew completed their final clearances. Oriana 7, this is Mission Control. You are go for launch. Copy that, Mission Control, Ellison responded. Ignition sequence start, T, -10, 9, 8. Naomi closed her eyes, bracing herself. The deep rumble of the engines vibrated through the entire cabin. 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. The force of acceleration pressed her back against her seat, the sheer power of the launch rattling through her bones. The world outside the viewport shifted, Earth falling away as they surged into the void. Minutes later, the violent shaking subsided. The weightlessness set in. A voice crackled through the comms. Orion 7, you have cleared the atmosphere. Welcome to space. Applause filled the cabin, the crew unstrapped, floating up into the zero-gravity environment, exchanging congratulatory grins and handshakes. Even Naomi couldn't suppress a small smile. Despite the tension, despite the doubt, she was here. She had made it. Ellison clapped a hand on Dr. Taylor's shoulder. Looks like your calculations were solid, Ross. Naomi held back the urge to roll her eyes. She reached for the panel in front of her, pulling up the thruster diagnostics. She had to be sure. As the data scrolled across the screen, her stomach clenched. The variance had increased. Slightly. But enough. Everything good, Carter? Ryan asked, floating beside her. She hesitated. I need to run a deeper scan. Ryan's expression darkened. Is it the same issue from before? Yes, sir. His jaw tightened. You need to tell Ellison. Naomi took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had let it go once. She wouldn't make the same mistake again. She turned toward the commander, ready to speak. Ready to insist? And then, without warning, the first alarm blared through the cabin. The shrill alarm cut through the cabin, turning the weightlessness of space into a suffocating tension. The flashing red warning light reflected off the instrument panels, casting eerie shadows across the crew's stunned faces. For half a second, no one spoke. No one moved. Then chaos erupted. Mission Control, we have an alert. Stand by for diagnostics, Commander Ellison barked, already pushing himself toward the main console. Taylor, what the hell is happening? Dr. Ross Taylor, still floating near the thruster panel, fumbled to bring up the diagnostics. His face, normally smug and unbothered, was tight with concentration. Naomi didn't wait for him. Her fingers were already flying over her own screen, bypassing the standard logs and running a direct systems check. Oxygen levels, power grid, nominal. Navigation, holding steady. Thrusters. Her stomach dropped. The variance spiked, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. It's the thruster system. I told you there was an issue. Ellison turned, eyes narrowing. How bad? Naomi's hands curled into fists before she forced them back to the controls. We're leaking fuel from one of the secondary thruster lines. If the pressure continues to drop, we lose directional control. Taylor's screen confirmed it a second later. He cursed under his breath. She's right. We need to shut it down before it gets worse. Ellison's expression flickered. Half frustration, half reluctant acceptance. Mission Control, we're initiating emergency shutdown of auxiliary thruster systems to prevent further fuel loss. Static filled the comms for a moment before a calm, measured voice answered. Copy that, Orion 7. Confirming data. Stand by. The delay was agonizing. Naomi felt her breath quicken as she watched the fuel pressure dip lower on her screen. The numbers were bleeding out faster than expected. They didn't have time to wait for Houston's approval. We need to override now, she pressed, turning toward Ellison. If we wait... You're not in charge, Carter, he snapped. Neither is Mission Control when we're out here, Ryan cut in. His voice was sharper than usual, filled with urgency. We have to move. Now. Ellison hesitated, his authority clashing against the reality of the situation. But Naomi could see the moment logic won out. Shut it down, he ordered. Naomi didn't wait for Taylor to do it. She reached over, bypassed the system's security lock, and forced the emergency shutdown command. The entire ship shuddered, a deep, reverberating groan vibrating through the hull as the auxiliary thrusters went offline. The sensation sent a chill down her spine. Even in space, the ship wasn't supposed to sound like that. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the fuel pressure stabilized. The numbers stopped dropping. Relief swept through the cabin, but it didn't last. "Mission Control, we've executed an emergency shutdown of auxiliary thrusters," Ellison reported. "Fuel leak appears to be contained for now." "Understood, Orion 7, came the reply. "But we have another problem." The tension in the cabin tightened like a noose. "What kind of problem?" Ellison asked. The voice on the other end didn't waver. "You're drifting." Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. Taylor scrambled to bring up their position. The ship, now lacking the stabilizing thrust from the auxiliary system, had begun a slow but undeniable roll off its intended trajectory. They were still moving forward, but at a slight angle, one that over time would take them dangerously off course. "We need a course correction," Naomi said immediately. Ellison turned to Taylor. "Can we compensate with the main thrusters?" Taylor grimaced. "Not without burning too much fuel. We don't have that kind of margin." Naomi's mind raced. There had to be a way to correct the drift without sacrificing their fuel reserves. She pushed herself toward the primary control panel, fingers tapping commands faster than she could think. "There's another option," she said. "We can use controlled bursts from the maneuvering thrusters to gradually adjust our orientation." Taylor shook his head. "That'll take forever. It's either that or risk running out of fuel before we reach the return window," she shot back. "You want to take that gamble?" Silence. Then, begrudgingly, Ellison nodded. "Do it." Naomi worked quickly, recalibrating the system. Each microburst had to be timed perfectly. Too strong, and they'd overcorrect, wasting fuel. Too weak, and they wouldn't fix the drift at all. The calculations ran through her mind like instinct, her hands moving with practiced precision. 1 burst. 2. 3. Slowly, ever so slowly, Orion 7 began to realign. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes on her. The same people who had dismissed her concerns less than a day ago were now watching, waiting, depending on her. She ignored them. She focused. 4 bursts. 5. 6. The ship steadied. "Orion 7, your trajectory is stabilizing," Mission Control confirmed. "Nice work." A breath Naomi didn't realize she had been holding finally escaped her lips. Taylor muttered something under his breath, too low to hear, before floating back to his station. The others exchanged glances, some relieved, some still rattled. Ellison pushed himself toward her, arms crossed. His face was unreadable. "You called it," he admitted. "Ah, yeah." She turned to him. "And you ignored it." His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue, didn't make excuses. "Next time," Naomi said, voice firm, "when I say something isn't right, you listen." Ellison held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. Just once. It was a small thing, but in this environment, it was as close to an apology as she was going to get. The crew slowly began to settle, adjusting to the reality that they had nearly lost control of the mission before it had even truly begun. But Naomi knew better than to relax. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that space never gave second chances. And something told her this was only the beginning. The silence after the crisis was almost as deafening as the alarm that had triggered it. The crew floated in an uneasy equilibrium, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them, even in zero gravity. Naomi remained at her station, scanning the diagnostics, unwilling to let the tension settle in her body. She had learned a long time ago that just because a problem seemed solved didn't mean it was over. Ellison ran a hand over his face, his eyes flickering between the crew members. He was a seasoned astronaut, but even he knew how close they had come to catastrophe. "Status report," he said finally, his voice rough around the edges. Taylor was still pulling up numbers on his display, but the slight shake in his hands didn't go unnoticed. Fuel reserve stabilized, but we lost a lot. We're still on course, but barely. If anything else goes wrong... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all knew. Naomi tapped through the remaining system checks, double-checking the maneuvering thrusters, the oxygen circulation, the artificial gravity generator. Everything that could spell disaster if it failed. It was all holding for now. But something still felt wrong. Ryan drifted beside her, lowering his voice. "What are you thinking?" She hesitated. She trusted her instincts more than anything, but saying "I have a bad feeling" wasn't exactly a scientific argument. Still, she had spent too long being ignored. "The pressure readings are stable, but the ship's structure took stress from the drift," she murmured. "I need to run a full integrity scan." Ellison caught her words. "You think we took damage?" Naomi clenched her jaw. "I think we need to check." For once, he didn't argue. "Do it." She initiated the scan, sending a pulse through the ship's framework, measuring for microfractures, weak points, anything that could compromise their hull. The data streamed in slowly, too slowly, making the wait unbearable. Taylor sighed. "We just need to make it to the mission checkpoint. We'll have time to..." The alarm blared again. Naomi whipped her head toward her screen. The hull integrity scan had come back. Red warnings flashing like sirens on the screen. A section of the outer plating just above the cargo bay had weakened significantly. It wasn't a full breach, not yet. But it would be. "We have a compromised section in the outer hull," Naomi announced, her voice sharper than she intended. "If we don't reinforce it now, we're going to lose structural integrity." Ellison cursed. "Mission Control, do you copy?" The comm line crackled. "We see it, Orion 7. That section is under stress. What's your recommendation?" Naomi was already running through the options in her head. "We can't fix it from the inside. Someone has to go out there." The silence that followed was thick. Spacewalks were standard in training, but terrifying in execution. One wrong move, one small miscalculation, and an astronaut could drift into the void with no way back. Open-ended. "I'll do it," Ryan said immediately. Naomi turned to him, her stomach twisting. "Ryan?" "I've had the most EVA experience after Ellison," he cut in. "We don't have time to argue. I'll patch the section, reinforce it, and be back inside before we even start to worry about oxygen levels." Ellison nodded, already moving toward the suit compartment. "All right, you suit up. I'll stay on comms with you the whole time." Naomi's fingers curled around the armrest of her seat. Everything in her wanted to stop him, to tell him there had to be another way. But there wasn't. She exhaled. "I'll run the exterior scans while you're out there. I'll guide you." Ryan gave her a small smile. "I'd expect nothing less." Within minutes, he was in his suit, helmet sealed, oxygen supply engaged. The airlock hissed open and Ryan stepped out into the abyss. The vast emptiness of space swallowed him, the tether connecting him to the ship the only thing keeping him from floating into infinity. "Comm check," Ellison said. "Loud and clear," Ryan replied. His voice was steady, but Naomi knew him well enough to hear the underlying tension. She kept her eyes on her screen, tracking his every move. "You need to move 2 meters starboard. The weak section is directly in front of you." Ryan propelled himself forward, reaching the damaged section. "Yeah, I see it. Definitely stress fractures." "Can you patch it?" "Yeah, but it's going to take time." Time. That was the one thing they never had enough of. As Ryan worked, Naomi kept an eye on every data stream. Heart rate, oxygen levels, radiation exposure. Every number that could determine if he made it back inside. Then, another warning flashed on her screen. "Ryan, stop moving." His breathing hitched. "What?" Naomi swallowed hard. "Your tether. The connection point is weakening." The ship had drifted. The added stress had affected more than just the hull. It had also compromised the very thing keeping him attached to the spacecraft. "Carter, how bad?" Ellison asked. She measured the numbers, fighting the rising panic. "He's got a few minutes before the tether gives out. If he pulls too hard, it could snap completely." Ryan was silent for a moment. Then, calmly, he said, "I'm almost done. Give me 90 seconds. 90 seconds? It felt like an eternity. Naomi's hands hovered over the emergency retrieval command. If he got detached, she had one shot at activating the thruster burst to push him back toward the ship. One shot. Ryan secured the last patch. Done. Naomi's pulse pounded. "You need to move slow. No sudden pulls." Ryan exhaled, beginning his return. "I've got this." He moved inch by inch, cautious, controlled. The tether strained, the weakened point stretching dangerously. Naomi watched every fraction of movement, fingers twitching over the controls. Then, the tether snapped. Ryan lurched backward, the recoil sending him tumbling away from the ship. "Ryan!" Naomi's voice was sharp, almost a scream. Ellison was already shouting into the comms. "Caldwell, activate your thrusters now." "I'm trying." Ryan's voice was strained, the panic barely held back. He was spinning, fighting to stabilize himself. Naomi didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand down on the emergency retrieval command. The ship's maneuvering thrusters fired in a calculated burst, pushing a pocket of force outward, just enough to nudge Ryan back toward them. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then Ryan's form slowed, his momentum shifted. He was close enough. Ellison propelled himself toward the airlock, reaching out, grasping Ryan's wrist in a death grip. "Got him!" The crew inside exhaled collectively as Ellison pulled Ryan back into the airlock. The hatch sealed shut, the decompression cycle activated. The moment the inner doors opened, Naomi was there. Ryan yanked off his helmet, gasping in deep, shaky breaths. Naomi grabbed his face, scanning him with wide eyes, making sure he was real. He laughed, breathless. "You saved me." She smirked, shaking her head. "You owe me." The moment shattered as Ellison exhaled. "We just bought ourselves time. But we're not out of this yet." Naomi looked at the ship's status. The repairs were holding, but they had burned more fuel. They were still at risk. And deep down, she knew. This mission wasn't over. The worst was still coming. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't the eerie calm before disaster, nor the tense quiet of anticipation. It was something heavier, something that settled deep into their bones. Ryan was safe, back inside the ship, but the reality of how close they had come to losing him still lingered in the air. Naomi sat at her console, hands still gripping the edges as if letting go would make everything unravel again. The emergency retrieval had burned more fuel than expected, and now their reserves were dangerously low. She ran the calculations again, her stomach twisting with each number. Ellison hovered nearby, arms crossed. "Tell me we still have a way home." Naomi exhaled. "We do, but it's going to be tight. Too tight." Taylor pulled himself toward the fuel monitor, frowning. "Even with the adjustments, we're still losing efficiency. We're going to need every last drop to make re-entry safe." Ellison nodded, his expression unreadable. "Option." Naomi hesitated. "We could cut power to non-essential systems. Ration the oxygen scrubbers to conserve energy. But even then, it's not a guarantee." Ryan, still shaking off the adrenaline, drifted closer. "What about using the emergency reserve thrusters? We'd have just enough to—" "No," Taylor shook his head sharply. "Those are for atmospheric entry only. We burn them now, and we don't make it through re-entry." Ellison rubbed his jaw, staring at the displays. The answer was clear, but no one wanted to say it. Naomi closed her eyes, steeling herself. "We need to shut down the main power grid." The crew stiffened. Ellison turned to her. "Are you suggesting we kill our own life support?" "Not entirely," she said quickly. "The backup batteries can keep the critical systems running, just enough to sustain us until we reach Earth's orbit. But the main reactor is pulling too much energy. If we don't cut it, we won't have enough to make it home." Taylor swore under his breath. "That's a hell of a risk." Ryan nodded. "But it's the only move we have." Ellison looked around at the crew, measuring the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion in their faces. "All right," he finally said. "We shut it down." Naomi worked quickly, her fingers moving over the controls with precision. One by one, the ship's lights dimmed, the hum of the reactor fading into an eerie stillness. The temperature dropped almost immediately. A metallic groan echoed through the cabin as the artificial gravity sputtered before cutting out entirely. Darkness settled over them, broken only by the faint glow of the emergency panels. Ellison exhaled, his breath misting slightly in the sudden cold. Now we wait. Hours passed, each minute stretched longer than the last. Naomi floated near the viewport, watching the stars outside remain unchanged, indifferent to their struggle. The vastness of space had never felt more suffocating. Ryan drifted beside her, arms crossed over his chest. "You were right." She turned her head slightly. "About what?" "About the thrusters, the hull stress, all of it." He let out a small chuckle. "You probably saved all our lives more than once." Naomi's throat tightened. "And yet I had to fight to be heard every single time." Ryan sighed. "Yeah, you did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he glanced at her. "Does it ever get easier?" She thought about it, about every battle she had fought to get to this point, every time she had been dismissed, underestimated, forced to prove herself over and over again. She gave a small, sad smile. "No. But you learned to stop waiting for permission." A crackle interrupted the moment. "Orion 7, this is Mission Control. We are receiving your signal. Do you copy?" Ellison bolted toward the comms. "Mission Control, this is Orion 7. We copy. We've shut down the main reactor to conserve fuel. We are preparing for re-entry." There was a brief pause before the reply came through. "Understood, Orion 7. We are calculating your re-entry trajectory now. Stand by." Naomi released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They weren't out of this yet, but they were close. Ellison turned to the crew. "All right, everyone suits up. This is going to be rough." Taylor activated the emergency thrusters, just enough to align them with Earth's atmosphere. The ship groaned again, a deep, unsettling sound that sent a chill through Naomi's body. The cabin trembled. The exterior temperature spiked as they hit the upper atmosphere, the ship vibrating violently as friction tore at its hull. The heat shields engaged, but the warnings blared anyway. Ryan gritted his teeth. Here we go. The force of gravity slammed into them all at once. Naomi's breath was stolen from her chest as the ship spiraled through the upper layers of the atmosphere, the fire of re-entry raging outside the viewports. The pressure was immense. Metal screamed under the strain. And then, a sudden, violent jolt. The thrusters failed. The ship tilted sharply, spinning, alarms shrieking in protest. "Stabilizers offline!" Taylor yelled. Ellison cursed. "Naomi, override now." Her fingers flew over the emergency controls, rerouting power, bypassing locks, anything to regain control. The ship was rolling, tumbling, the planet rushing toward them at a terrifying speed. She found the stabilizer command. She slammed her fist against it. The engines roared back to life. The ship groaned but steadied, leveling out just enough to prevent them from tearing apart on descent. The air inside was filled with heavy breathing, the sound of bodies slamming against restraints. Ellison's voice came through, hoarse but steady. "Mission Control, we have stabilized. Repeat, we have stabilized." The reply was immediate. "Copy that, Orion 7. You are on final descent. Brace for impact." The ocean rushed toward them. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut. A final explosion of force. Then everything went black. She woke to the sound of voices, shouting, rushing water, the weight of gravity pressing down on her body again. Her vision swam as she unbuckled her harness, gasping for air. The cabin was tilted, water leaking through cracks in the exterior. Ryan groaned beside her, already struggling to undo his restraints. "We made it." Naomi let out a short, breathless laugh. "Yeah, we did." The hatch was forced open from the outside. Blinding light poured in, silhouetting the figures in rescue gear waiting to pull them free. As she was lifted from the wreckage, the last thing she heard was Ellison's voice, rough with exhaustion. "You saved our lives, Carter." She looked at him, at the others, at the wreckage of Orion 7 bobbing in the ocean behind them. And for the first time since launch, she allowed herself to believe it.